On the Burrup Peninsula in Western Australia, there are constructed stone walls that may be 20,000 to 30,000 years old, and no one has established what they were for. It will look like a question left in stone before the pyramids, before Stonehenge, before the usual story of ancient building even begins. The place is Murujuga, on the northwest coast near the Dampier archipelago. Today, if you approach it on a map, you see roads, port infrastructure, industrial leases, and a hard red coastline pushing into the Indian Ocean. On the ground, the air can feel dry in the throat. The rocks are dark, iron-stained, and hot enough in summer to hold the sun after it has moved. Wind moves through the boulder fields with a low scrape, and under that modern sound is something much older. Murujuga is already known for one of the greatest cultural records on Earth. Across this peninsula and nearby islands, there are roughly 1 to 2 million petroglyphs. That makes it the densest concentration of rock art anywhere on the planet. Faces, animals, tracks, bodies, marks of movement and memory are cut into the stone. It is a whole landscape carrying human presence across deep time. But inside that same landscape, at Climbing Men Valley, the record changes form. The Murujuga stone terrace walls at Climbing Men Valley, Burrup Peninsula, WA, massive constructed terraces of unestablished function, rise from the ground as built stone features. They do not show a kangaroo, a footprint, or a human figure. They are stone placed against stone, lines and mass and effort, holding a shape that researchers still have not reduced to a clear purpose, and that is what makes them difficult to walk past. If these walls stood beside a famous ruin in Europe or the Middle East, their age alone would draw cameras, funding, and arguments for decades. Here, they sit inside an Aboriginal landscape that has been inhabited for tens of thousands of years, close to industry, close to heritage debate, and close to a World Heritage nomination, submitted in 2023. While the basic question remains open. What were these terraces doing in Climbing Men Valley? If ancient Australian places like this matter to you, subscribe now, because the next part walks into the valley itself. At Climbing Men Valley, within Murujuga on the Burrup Peninsula, the land does not announce itself like a monument. There is no neat entrance, no stone gateway, no sign that tells your mind how old the ground beneath you is. The valley sits among dark volcanic-looking boulders and ridges, with the Pilbara light flattening distance until everything seems close and far at the same time. To understand the terraces, you have to picture the setting first. The stone here is not soft cave wall. It is hard, weathered, iron-rich rock, often with a dark outer skin that can take thousands of years to form. When your hand gets near it, you imagine heat coming back from the surface. Small stones shift underfoot. The dry smell of spinifex and dust sits in the air, and scattered through this harsh ground are surfaces carrying engravings, marks cut by human hands across a span of time that most cities cannot even begin to measure. Then the terrace walls appear as a different kind of evidence. They rise from the slope as built stone features, heavy and deliberate. You are looking at stone moved into place, stone stacked or arranged so that the land itself has been altered. The Climbing Men Valley terrace walls do not explain themselves. They sit in the same country as the engravings, but they speak in another way. That is why the age estimate matters so much. Researchers have placed them somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 years old. Even the cautious end of that range is difficult to absorb. The Great Pyramid in Egypt is around 4,500 years old. Stonehenge is roughly 5,000 years old in its main phases. These walls, if the estimate is right, belong to a time far deeper than the monuments most people are taught to picture when they hear the word ancient. And yet the careful word remains estimate. There is no permission here to turn uncertainty into a neat story. No confirmed farming system has been established. No single purpose has been proven. The walls are real, the landscape is real, the age range is extraordinary, and the function is still open. So the question becomes sharper. If a built stone feature this old stands inside one of the richest Aboriginal cultural landscapes on Earth, why is it still so hard to say what it was doing there? Inside Climbing Men Valley on the Burrup Peninsula, the difficulty is that the stones sit among too much evidence. Around them, Murujuga is covered with marks that prove people were watching this country closely for an almost unimaginable length of time. A ridge can carry engravings on one face, loose blocks at its base, and then, a little farther on, the built lines of the terraces themselves. That matters, because a lonely structure can be dismissed too easily. A wall in an empty place becomes a puzzle with no frame, but here, the frame is everywhere. The rock surfaces hold animals, tracks, and human forms. Some figures are clear enough that even a person with no training can see a body, a leg, a head, a tail. Others are worn down into shallow grooves, visible only when the light hits at an angle. In late afternoon, the stone can turn copper black, and the cuts seem to come forward for a few minutes, then sink back again. The terrace walls belong to that same hard country, but they force a different kind of attention. A petroglyph can carry an image. A terrace changes the ground. It asks about labor, movement, planning, and repeated use of place. Someone, or many people over time, understood this slope well enough to arrange stone in a way that still interrupts the valley today. This is where the usual shortcut fails. People often hear ancient structure and want a single answer. Farming, ceremony, shelter, boundary, storage. But at Climbing Men Valley, researchers have not established that kind of answer. The careful position is uncomfortable because it leaves the walls standing in front of us without a caption, and the landscape does not make that silence easier. The nearby petroglyphs show that this was known, used, marked, returned to. The terraces sit inside a cultural record so dense that Murujuga is often discussed as one of the most important rock art landscapes in the world. So, when these walls refuse to fit neatly into a known category, the refusal carries weight. The next step is to look at the explanations that have been suggested and the evidence that has not yet allowed any of them to settle. Because one tempting answer sounds obvious at first until the ground itself starts arguing back. At Climbing Men Valley on the Burrup Peninsula, the tempting explanation is the one many people reach for first. Terraces mean farming. Across the world, stepped stone walls often bring to mind fields cut into hillsides, soil held back, water guided, plants grown in narrow bands. It is a familiar picture. Your mind supplies it almost automatically, but the Pilbara ground does not let that answer settle easily. The valley is dry, stony, and exposed. The rocks have sharp edges. Dust gathers in pockets, and the smell of heated earth comes up when the sun is high. If these walls were agricultural terraces, researchers would expect stronger signs around them. Clear soil preparation, crop evidence, irrigation patterns, or other traces that make the function stand up. That has not been established. That careful limit is important. It does not make the walls less interesting. It makes them harder. A simple answer would be comfortable. People built them to grow food, and the mystery ends there. But at this site, the known evidence does not allow that kind of tidy label. The terrace walls remain massive stone structures in a landscape famous for human presence, with no confirmed purpose attached to them. So, what can be said safely? Stone was arranged, the slope was altered, the work took planning, because even a small wall in this country is not light labor. A larger set of terraces means choosing stones, moving them, placing them, and returning to the same line of work, long enough for the shape to matter. When wind moves through the valley and loose gravel clicks under a boot, that physical effort is what becomes impossible to ignore. Here, responsible archaeology feels less dramatic than speculation, but far more powerful. No serious reading needs to pretend the walls are something they have not been proven to be. Their age range, 20,000 to 30,000 years, already places them in a category that challenges the common public story of ancient construction. Their unestablished function is part of the evidence because it tells us the site has not been fully translated into modern terms, and if farming does not explain them, at least not yet, then the valley opens wider. The walls may relate to movement, gathering, social use, ceremony, or something that does not fit a single modern word, but each possibility demands evidence. The next problem is that some evidence in Murujuga is visible everywhere, while some of it may be almost impossible to read. Within Murujuga on the Burrup Peninsula, evidence can sit in plain sight and still remain difficult to understand. That is part of the problem with the Climbing Men Valley walls. The valley gives you stone, slope, engraving, distance, heat, and age. It does not give you an instruction sheet. For archaeologists, a structure usually becomes clearer when it is surrounded by matching clues. A hearth might sit near charcoal, a tool might carry wear on its edge, a wall might connect to water control, housing, storage, or repeated footpaths, but these terraces have not yet produced a public explanation strong enough to close the case. Their scale says human effort, their position says intention. Their purpose stays out of reach. And then there is the cultural side, which matters just as much as the scientific one. Murujuga is Aboriginal country. It is connected to living custodians, to law, to memory, and to responsibilities that do not begin when a researcher arrives with a notebook. Some knowledge may be held within community, some meanings may be restricted, some may have been damaged by disruption over time. A modern report can record stones and measurements, but it may still miss the kind of relationship that made a place important. That is why the phrase unestablished function has to be handled carefully. It does not mean meaningless. It means that, in the public archaeological record, no confirmed use has been settled. The Murujuga stone terrace walls at Climbing Men Valley in Burrup Peninsula, WA, massive constructed terraces of unestablished function may have carried meanings that were practical, social, ceremonial, or layered in ways that do not separate cleanly. Imagine standing there in late light. The engraved rocks darken. The air cools just enough for the dust smell to lift. The terraces hold their line across the slope, quiet and heavy, while nearby petroglyphs keep their animals and figures in stone. One part of the landscape shows images, or another part shows work. Together, they make the valley feel less like a ruin and more like a record with missing pages. But missing pages are not empty pages. And in Murujuga, the next pressure on that record is not ancient at all. It comes from the modern coast just beyond the stones. On the Burrup Peninsula, only a short distance from Climbing Men Valley, the ancient stone record shares the coast with a very modern one. Roads cut through the industrial edge, metal structures catch the sun. At times, the sound is engines, trucks, and the dull mechanical hum of a working port landscape. That closeness changes how the terraces are seen. If they were far inland, beyond roads and leases, the main problem might be research access or dating. Here, the question sits beside industry. Murujuga's rock art has drawn concern because emissions near the peninsula may affect the outer surfaces of the stone. Those dark skins matter. They are part of what holds the engravings visible. If the surface changes, the record can change with it. The terrace walls are part of the same cultural landscape under discussion. Their risk may not be identical to the engraved panels, and the science has to be careful about that. But protection does not work well when a place is sliced into separate pieces in the mind. A valley, a slope, a panel, a wall, a ridge, a pathway through stone country. Together, they form the setting that gives each feature meaning. In 2023, Australia submitted a World Heritage nomination for Murujuga. That step placed the peninsula before the world as a cultural landscape of outstanding importance. It also made the contrast harder to ignore. A place can be nominated for global recognition while still facing questions about what nearby industrial activity is doing to its rock surfaces. Listen to the tension in that. On one side, the terraces may date to 20,000 to 30,000 years ago. On the other, decisions are being made in the language of monitoring, approvals, emissions, and management plans. One timeline is measured in deep human occupation. The other is measured in reports and review periods. And in Climbing Men Valley, the walls remain physically simple to look at. Stone set against stone, rough edges, dark faces, gaps where light cuts through, but around them the modern world is no longer simple at all. Recognition has arrived. Concern has arrived. The nomination has arrived. What has not arrived is the answer to a harder question. How do you protect a place properly when part of its meaning is still not understood? From Climbing Men Valley on the Burrup Peninsula, the modern effort to protect Murujuga can feel strangely flat compared with the place itself. On paper, a cultural landscape becomes maps, boundaries, assessment language, and heritage values. On the ground, it is heat coming off stone, small lizards moving between rocks, and walls that sit across a slope with no agreed explanation. The gap matters. A World Heritage nomination has to describe why a place is important in words that committees, governments, and experts can test. It needs categories. It needs evidence. It needs a case that can travel far from the Pilbara and still make sense in a meeting room. But the terrace walls push against that neatness. They are physical, old, and deliberate, yet their role has not been pinned down. Here, Murujuga becomes more than a famous rock art site. The petroglyphs are extraordinary because they are visible records. They can be counted, photographed, compared, monitored. Their scale is almost beyond normal speech. 1 to 2 million engraved images across the peninsula and islands. The walls at Climbing Men Valley belong to that same country, but they ask a rougher question. How do you value a feature when the strongest honest statement is still, "We do not fully know"? For traditional custodians, this is living country, with cultural responsibility attached to place. For researchers, it is a problem of evidence. For heritage managers, it becomes a practical challenge, deciding how to protect something whose meaning may not be fully public, fully preserved, or fully settled by archaeology. Stand there, and the problem becomes less abstract. You can hear the dry tick of stones underfoot. You can see the dark faces of boulders, some carrying marks, some forming lines. You can feel how close the industrial coast is, even when you cannot see every plant or road from the valley floor. The ancient and the modern share the same air. And that is the point at which Climbing Men Valley begins to unsettle the usual world map of ancient construction. Because if these walls were somewhere else, under a different historical label, we might already have given them a much louder name. At Climbing Men Valley in Murujuga, the comparison with famous ancient places is useful only if it changes the scale in your head. Most people have a mental shelf for Egypt, Mesopotamia, Stonehenge, the old cities of the Mediterranean. Those places are treated as the standard examples of building, planning, and organized ancient life. Then, the Burrup Peninsula interrupts that shelf. The terrace walls here are estimated at 20,000 to 30,000 years old. Even if you stay cautious, even if you keep the wide range and refuse to sharpen it beyond the evidence, the age still forces a pause. You are looking at construction in a deep-time landscape where Aboriginal occupation reaches far beyond the public story many people grew up hearing. The valley itself does not feel like a textbook argument. It feels rough, bright, and physical. The stone underfoot has weight. The boulders throw hard shadows. A fly lands, leaves, comes back. Somewhere nearby, an engraved surface may hold a figure cut into rock, while the terraces hold another kind of mark, a change made to the slope itself. If you are listening closely, this is where the place stops being remote and starts being central. The old public myth about Aboriginal Australia was often built around absence. No cities, no monuments, no architecture in the narrow sense outsiders expected. Murujuga makes that myth look very small. The petroglyphs alone already do that. But the walls at Climbing Men Valley add a separate pressure because they are built forms whose purpose remains unsettled, and they sit inside a cultural landscape now being weighed for World Heritage recognition. This is why exaggeration is unnecessary. The truth is already strong enough. Researchers have an extraordinary age estimate. Custodians hold living relationships to the country. Heritage processes are trying to describe a place that resists simple description. Industry sits close enough to make protection urgent, and the stones keep refusing the easiest label. So the question changes. The landscape has already answered that. The question now is sharper and less comfortable. What kind of history has to be standing in front of us before we finally learn how to see it? At Climbing Men Valley on the Burrup Peninsula, that sharper question gathers in one place. The stone terraces, the engraved boulders, the industrial coast, and the heritage nomination press against each other. Look first at the ground. The walls rise from rough stone country, estimated at 20,000 to 30,000 years old, with no established purpose. Then lift your view to the wider Murujuga landscape, carrying roughly 1 to 2 million petroglyphs. That is the densest rock art on Earth. Now widen again. Out toward the coastline, where industry sits close enough for emissions concerned to become part of the heritage debate, and over all of it sits the 2023 World Heritage nomination. That is the meeting point, a built feature with an open function, a rock art landscape of global scale, a modern industrial zone, a formal attempt to place Murujuga among the world's most important cultural places. The air itself seems to carry the contradiction. You can imagine the dry click of gravel underfoot in the valley, and beyond it, the low thrum of machinery. One sound belongs to walking slowly through stone, the other belongs to the present moving fast. Here the phrase, "shouldn't exist," has to be handled with care. The walls do not challenge Aboriginal history. They challenge the small version of Aboriginal history that many outsiders inherited. The mystery is already there, in the honest gap between what can be seen and what can be proven. The Murujuga stone terrace walls at Climbing Men Valley, Burrup Peninsula, Western Australia, massive constructed terraces of unestablished function, force a different kind of attention from the famous petroglyphs around them. The engravings say, "People marked this place." The walls add, "People shaped this place." And at their estimated age, that shaping reaches back into a time most public histories rarely connect with built stone forms in Australia. It is a test, not only of archaeology, but of modern responsibility. Because if a place can be this old, this dense with cultural evidence, this exposed to present-day pressure and still not fully understood, what exactly are we protecting when we say we are protecting it? At Climbing Men Valley, within Murujuga, the final answer is not a decoded purpose. That would be too easy, and it would be false confidence. The walls remain what the evidence allows them to be, massive stone features estimated at 20,000 to 30,000 years old, standing inside one of the richest Aboriginal cultural landscapes on the planet, with their functions still not established. That is the honest ending, but it is not a small one, because the more you hold the facts together, the larger the place becomes. Around them is Murujuga, carrying roughly 1 to 2 million petroglyphs across the peninsula and islands. Beside that ancient record is a modern coastline, where industrial emissions have become part of the concern around the rock art. Above it all is the 2023 World Heritage nomination, a formal attempt to say, in the language of the present, that this place matters to the world. The terraces sit at the center of that collision. Their power comes from restraint. Stone was moved, ground was shaped, time passed on a scale that makes most famous monuments feel recent. The explanation has not caught up, and that matters, because protection often depends on description. A place is easier to defend when it can be named, classified, dated neatly, and explained in one clean sentence. Climbing Men Valley refuses that comfort. It asks for care before certainty. It asks for attention before the full caption is written. Picture the valley late in the day. The heat begins to leave the rocks. The engravings darken into the boulder faces. The terrace lines hold their shape across the slope, quiet against the red ground. Beyond them, the coast continues its modern work. The stones do not answer back. A wall can stand for thousands of years and still be waiting for the right kind of listening. The dust settles in the gaps between the rocks. Light drops behind the ridge, and for a moment, the old surfaces and the new world share the same fading color. If this changed how you picture ancient Australia, stay with the channel for more stories from landscapes that still have not finished speaking.